So, Andrea, if you're not aware, she has worked for many, many, many years in education. And in fact, Bloomberg Professor of Business Journalism at Baruch College, CUNY, and is the author most recently of a critically acclaimed After the Education Wars, How Smart Schools Upend the Business of Reform.
Hi there.
Andrea, Gabor.
Hi.
How are you?
Nice to see you.
Welcome.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome to our club. This is the relatively new Democratic club, about 2.5 years old, young rather, and we're just trying to bring a change. Community first, a new way of doing politics in Northern half. Before turning our attention to education, Professor Gabor spent over 2 decades as a business writer. She worked as a staff writer and editor at Business Week and the U.S. News and World Report. Her other books include The Man Who Discovered Quality, Times Books, 1990, about the quality guru Edward Deming and his impact on the industry in the U.S. and Japan. The Capitalist Philosophers, Crown Press, 2000. Professor Gabor's research is supported by various foundations, including funds made available from the endowment of her Bloomberg chair. Without further ado, Andrea Gabor.
Great, thanks. I got started on this journey of education reform back at the start of the Bloomberg administration, long before I held this chair, when I was asked by a wonky business magazine to write an article, a management article, about the New York City Principals Leadership Academy. Is everyone familiar with the New York City Principals Leadership Academy? If you are, raise your hand. Okay, so a few people, okay. So the Leadership Academy was started by Mayor Bloomberg as a way to train a new cadre of principals for this new group of wonderful small schools that the administration was planning to start, and to substitute for those failing big schools in New York City. And the Leadership Academy really had 2 parents. One of the parents was, it was modeled in part on General Electric's vaunted Crotonville Leadership Training Center, which just before I was assigned this article had been renamed the Jack Welch Leadership Training Center after the CEO of General Electric. Well, I see some people nodding. As you may know, or some of you know, Jack Welch's nickname was Neutron Jack. And he was known as Neutron Jack because he had a penchant for closing any business that wasn't number 1 or 2 in its industry, and he had a similarly brutal approach to his employees. And one of the very first, and by the way, very important, this was one of the foundations for the Leadership Academy. I'll get to the other foundation in a moment. So one of the very first training sessions I went to had none other than Jack Welch lecturing to a bunch of aspiring principals, New York City principals. And I was transfixed. I was fascinated. And that was the moment I really got hooked. I wanted to know, what could Neutron Jack teach these New York City educators? And how was that, and how were those lessons going to be received? Okay, so that's the question that really got me hooked. And in many ways, that moment, the Leadership Academy, the bringing in of Jack Welch, that whole corporate mindset became a metaphor for me for what was going on, not just in New York City, but also nationally. Okay, and one of the first, and keep in mind now, I was a business reporter. I knew nothing about education in New York City. I didn't even have children at that point, okay? And one of the things I discovered early on was that New York City had this deep bench of really gifted educators. And I know there are some teachers in the room. Teachers? How many teachers? Oh, a lot of teachers, okay? So deep bench of teachers, and many of them were linked, I learned, to this progressive movement of small schools. And as many of you know, pardon? That's me. That's you, see? So long before the Bloomberg administration, I hope I'm not, I know some of you know this stuff, but long before the Bloomberg administration, Debbie Meyer had founded Central Park East, the Progressive Schools Movement, et cetera. And this is very important that she conceived of this as a collaborative enterprise with teacher leaders, a very kind of democratically run approach to schools, okay? And this I realized was very important. The other thing that was important was that this progressive movement was supported by a whole infrastructure that had been set up by, at the time, Tony Alvarado, who some of you know, I see heads nodding, the superintendent of District 4 and later of District 2. And one example of the sort of successful networks of progressive schools that grew out of this early Debbie Meyer movement were the 14 international high schools, which were where mostly kids who were English language learners went to school. These schools were very, and are still very successful. And they were founded by a man named Eric Nadelstern. Does that name ring a bell with folks here? Okay, I see a lot of heads. Okay, good. We're going to come back to Eric Nadelstern. Okay. Another one of Debbie Meyer's colleagues who plays a major starring role in my book is Ann Cook, who was the founder of the Julia Richmond complex here in Manhattan, where one of the first and most successful efforts to take over a large failing high school and replace it with a bunch of small schools took place. Now, Julia Richmond was a hotbed of innovation. There were 6 schools, and are still 6 schools in the complex, and they shared facilities that no single small school could ever have afforded on its own. And of course, one of the big criticisms of small schools is that, you can't have all the AP programs and you can't have the sports teams and all this stuff. Well, in the Julia Richmond complex, 6 schools shared a gorgeous auditorium, gymnasium, a well-stocked library, music rooms. I could go on and on. And all of these 6 schools managed these facilities by consensus, okay? For decades, they managed it by consensus, which is very difficult, as I'm sure you could realize, but this was also important. At Urban Academy, Julia Richmond's anchor school, the commitment to developing a community of teacher leaders who could democratically run the school was so deep that new teachers, when they came to Urban Academy, they did not have to teach a full course load. They had mentor teachers who would observe them, coach them, bring them along for at least a year, and that's a system that continues. So again, this very deep commitment to democracy, collaboration, et cetera. So one of the arguments I make is that both the promise as well as the missed opportunities of the Bloomberg administration can be seen in the way that the administration treated this deep bench of talent, okay? And it's not that the Bloomberg administration didn't recognize the talent. They promoted and protected many of the leaders of this progressive movement. But at the end of the day, neither Bloomberg nor Joel Klein ever fully trusted public school educators. And that, I came to the conclusion, was a fatal flaw of that administration. The Leadership Academy was a great example. Remember I said that it had 2 parents, right? One was General Electric's Leadership Training Center. The other one was the Leadership Training Program in District 2, which was run by a woman named Sandra Stein. So this was set up, within the public school district by Tony Alvarado. Sandra Stein ran it. Well, Sandra Stein, Bloomberg administration recognized her talent. They bring her over to the Leadership Academy, but not to head it. Okay, to be the CEO of the Leadership Academy, they hire the former CEO of a failed telecommunications company, okay? Now this lasts for about 2 years, and the CEO of the failed telecommunications company is out. Sandra Stein becomes the CEO. But this is a pattern in one form or another that repeats itself over and over again, okay? Another example is what happened when the Bloomberg administration and the Gates Foundation, a very important player, and if you guys want to talk about the influence of big philanthropy, which I'm doing a lot of work on these days, we can do that later, when they discovered the Julia Richmond complex in about the year 2000, which is really the birth of the Gates Foundation's K through 12 education philanthropy. That's when they appoint their first education director, a man by the name of Vander Ark, who comes to New York, goes to the Julia Richmond complex, spends a year trolling the halls, watching the classes, looking at the portfolio model that the students are producing. And he's infatuated, and he actually ends up testifying before Congress, and I'm only slightly exaggerating when I say that he basically tells Congress he's found the solution to what ails American education. It's small schools, okay? Meanwhile, back at the ranch at the Julia Richmond complex, Ann Cook, for a year, had been telling him small is a necessary but not sufficient ingredient for improvement. Necessary but not sufficient, okay? And what she meant by that was, and by the way, I disagree with her, and I'll explain why, that small schools are necessary. Small schools make it possible, make it actually easier to have the kinds of relationships that make improvement possible. The mentoring of junior faculty by senior faculty, the cultivating trust among faculty as well as between faculty and students, cultivating the relationships between neighboring schools that maybe make it possible to have consensus around shared facilities, right? Small schools make it possible but do not guarantee it, okay? So what the Gates Foundation and the Bloomberg administration did was they went and they took over high schools, right? And they stocked them willy-nilly with small schools, including charter schools, right? But these were not carefully curated institutions, okay? There was very little training, very little coordination, let alone collaboration. There was no secret sauce, okay? So how do you make a better system of schools of both small schools and large schools in a city like New York with 1 million kids? Okay, that's a really big question, and no one has cracked that one. Well, there was one guy in the Bloomberg administration who thought he had a solution. And that guy was Eric Nadelstern. Remember, he was the one who I mentioned started the international high school, the international schools for English language learners that was so very successful. Well, he became Joe Klein's top deputy. Now, it's an interesting question why Nadelstern was tapped as a deputy where Joe Klein was a business guy and he was the man in charge, but that was the pattern of the Bloomberg administration. We can also have an interesting conversation for those of you who know Nadelstern about kind of the path he took, okay? But Nadelstern is a very smart guy, and he came up with an interesting proposal, which is the network structure. How many people have heard of the network structure? Okay, a few people, okay. So he based this idea on the relationships that had allowed networks of progressive schools like the international schools, to flourish. And a core tenet of the Progressive Coalition had been that schools function best when they are part of a like-minded network of support. A like-minded network of support. And the networks had several very promising features. Okay, they were self-selecting. So schools, in theory, could select any network leader they wanted to, or band together with like-minded schools and select a network. The network leaders served as a countervailing power to the superintendents. Are there any superintendents here? Okay, good. Because there are capricious superintendents, right? And so having that countervailing power was powerful. And some of those networks actually encouraged experimentation and protected schools and networks that wanted to experiment. And Nadelstern also estimated that the networks saved about $500,000 per school, okay, by breaking up the bureaucracy. And much of that money actually for a time flowed back to the schools, because one of the things that I think the Bloomberg administration did right was to give more autonomy to the schools and to give them budgetary control, okay, or at least more budgetary control. Many of the networks worked, especially those that had, where the schools had experience with collaborative cultures. But by the time the networks were introduced, this was in the third term of the Bloomberg administration, and as you will recall, it was, what was it, version 5.8 or 6.8 of Bloomberg reforms, after multiple reorganizations, right? And by that time, Bloomberg had lost his credibility with educators. The networks also were probably rolled out too quickly citywide. Again, it was an example of everything having to be, too fast, too big, etc. So despite the pleas of hundreds of principals who wanted to preserve the networks, when de Blasio became mayor, one of the first things he did was he ended the networks, okay? And what we saw under his chancellor, under Farina, was this giant pendulum swing back to top-down management and central control, okay? So Bloomberg failed the key test of leadership, which is not only succession planning, and I'm sure many of you remember the Kathy Black story, right? But the inability to, after 12 years in office, to cement any of his real reforms. Okay, it's an astonishing failure of education reform. So I wanted to go back just for a moment to Ann Cook's statement that small is a necessary but not sufficient ingredient, okay? It may be easier, as I mentioned, with small schools, but it's emphatically not true, because one of the things that I do in my book is I write about a number of actually very large entities that have tackled meaningful collaborative education reform, in particular the state of Massachusetts, and that is with its 1993 Education Reform Act, which is an absolutely remarkable achievement and story. I also write about the Leander District in Texas, which is probably the biggest and maybe the most important district you've never heard of. It's now about the size of New Orleans, and they adopted the teachings of a guy by the name of W. Edwards Deming, who Senator Jackson mentioned, and who I will just briefly reference. So to explain why, I think it's worked in these bigger places, I want to take a step back and finish up where I usually begin, which is why the ed reform movement, I think, has really failed nationwide, okay? My argument is that the reformers have borrowed all of the outdated top-down carrot and stick management practices that failed American industry back in the 1980s, which is, and I'm really dating myself now, which is when I started in journalism, and my job was to cover all of these American industries that were struggling, and to cover the automakers in Detroit that were getting pummeled by nimbler competitors, especially in Japan. So what the Japanese had figured out, with Deming's help, and then later the US auto industry and a number of other industries, was that collaborative, grassroots-driven improvement is the key to competitiveness, okay? And they learned lessons from the systems thinkers, especially Deming, that it is those closest to any given process or system. In the case of the auto industry, it would be auto workers. In the case of schools, it would be teachers and even students, okay, who are best equipped to identify problems and come up with potential solutions, okay? Well, if that's the job of rank and file employees, then what's the role of management? Well, Deming's breakthrough observation was that the challenge for management is to make that knowledge, that rank and file knowledge, actionable. Okay? And there are many ways in which to do this. One of the ways is to provide really in-depth training. Think back on Julia Richmond, where you train employees to understand what they're seeing, understand what's going wrong, troubleshoot solutions, communicate with each other, communicate up the chain of command. That's one way. But probably the most important way that management does this, or could do this, is by creating a culture of trust. Okay? Sounds wishy-washy, right? Well, Deming, who was a statistician and a data guy, had this great vision that you cannot possibly have rank and file workers doing their job of finding problems and proposing solutions if they feared for their jobs. The only way you can do it is if you create a culture of trust where people trust each other, don't fear for their jobs, and are safe to collaborate. Okay? And the progressive schools in New York City understood this. The folks in Massachusetts, because that 1993 Ed Reform Act was a highly collaborative enterprise, and the folks in Leander, Texas understood this. So you're talking about, and as did a number of other institutions around the country, okay? So you're talking about vastly different institutions, red states, blue states, big schools, big districts, small districts, unionized, non-unionized, but they all understood this fundamental, that these fundamental ingredients were important. And I would just want to mention two other things. The work in New York City in the Progressive Coalition and in Leander, Texas, also relied on what I think is another very important ingredient, which is that they both won exemptions from rigid state rules. Okay? In New York City, Ann Cook established the New York State Performance Standards Consortium, which won exemptions from most standardized testing for their students, so they developed a whole new approach to assessment. And I know the senator is very interested in the opt-out movement, as are many of you. Completely different approach, much more meaningful approach to assessment for the students. And in Texas, what happened is that a education secretary under Ann Richards, remember Ann Richards? A New Yorker by the name of Skip Menow from Syracuse, first education secretary in Texas who was out of state. He gets to Texas and he says, if there is anything, he says to the districts, if there's anything getting in the way of your doing the kind of work that you think needs to be done, let me know and we'll grant you an exemption. And the folks in Leander said, okay, we're going to take that seriously. And they sat down, the teachers, and it was a pretty small district still at that time. They sat down, the teachers and the superintendent and so forth, said, the single biggest problem is our punitive teacher evaluations, because that was in the early 90s, right? Post Nation at Risk, and all sorts of states were imposing these punitive teacher evaluations. They said, we can't build trust with these punitive teacher evaluations. So they applied for an exemption and they won it. And no one has yet been able to explain to me how it is that year after year after year, for decades, Texas, the homeland of punitive testing, kept renewing that exemption, and it became the foundation for building this culture of trust in Leander, which was the basis for everything that they did. Now the size of New Orleans, an incredibly successful district. So what these examples show is that experimentation is key, and it is possible to find a balance between oversight at the state and federal level while making it possible for localities to experiment. Because it's only through experimentation carefully done experimentation, then you'll get real innovation. Sorry, I'm done. Yeah, I apologize. We don't have a mic here, but okay. So that's it for my opening remarks. I'm happy to take your questions, Senator, or anybody from the audience.
We're going to have first Senator.
Great.
In your book, Andrea, you refer to the quiet revolution in education, and at times call it guerrilla movement that evolved over decades. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that, and what does this movement look like today?
Okay. Thank you for that question.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Yes? Okay.
Thank you for that question. What I meant by the quiet revolution is that, and this really goes to the kind of the core of my book, which is that I basically argue that somewhere in the United States, some school, some school district, some state is really doing amazing work, that all of the reform that we might want to see is already happening around us, okay? The challenge is, how do you scale it, okay? How do you kind of spread that guerrilla movement, if you will? And the opposing force are the corporate ed reformers, okay? Fueled by the incredible money of big philanthropy. And people who know me well know that I think of myself as kind of a Pollyanna. I assume good motives, okay? And I am willing to concede that the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, the Walton, maybe even the Walton Foundation, have good intentions, okay? But good intentions are not the same as knowing what you're doing, okay? And so when I talk about the quiet revolution, I talk about what educators have been trying to do, many of them very successfully, but it's a tough fight.
Are there any questions as a follow-up to that?
So let me ask a question with respect to the Bloomberg administration. I was a member of City Council at the time when the panel for educational policy had to vote on whether or not to hold back third graders that basically did not pass the third grade reading exam. I was opposed to that, and many other people was. Some experts in the field said that holding back a third grader would have a devastating impact on their future as far as education goes. Mayor Bloomberg removed 2 members of the panel because they were going to vote no, and he wanted them to vote yes, and literally moved them an hour, 2 hours right before the vote. And the borough of Staten Island Borough President removed his person. And so what's your opinion about that with respect to education and also parent involvement in education?
Okay, wow. Oh my gosh, how long do we have? Okay.
1 minute.
All right. So just as a side note, what's really interesting, by the way, how long did that continue in New York? Because I remember that happened, but how long did they hold the kids back? How long did that last? It didn't last very long. Okay. Well, Mississippi and Alabama, by the way, Mississippi is now doing that, and Alabama is about to do that. Okay, and they're following Jeb Bush's playbook in instituting these policies. And I think in Mississippi, it looked like almost a quarter of third graders were going to be held back. I mean, it's devastating, right? But about parent involvement, so there's this really interesting question. I don't claim to have the answer about the balance between again, grassroots parent influence and, say, mayoral control. So an interesting question is, I think most people love the idea of pre-K, right? Could pre-K have been done as quickly without mayoral control? I don't know the answer to that, okay? But there are some benefits to being able to do things relatively quickly. But here's the downside, and I'm a real believer in messy democracy, and you all, I think, are down there in the trenches doing this. I actually went to one of the PEP meetings when they were about to close a school in East Harlem. This happened to be a very successful school, okay? And you might ask yourself, why were they about to close a successful school in East Harlem? Well, it was one of those small schools, really small, started during the Bloomberg years, and this was Farina who was about to close this school. And the community was up in arms by any measure, whether you looked at test scores, how the 40% of kids who were special needs were doing, the schools that the kids got into for high school, how the first crop of high school kids ended up doing going to college. By every measure, this was a successful school, okay? And I sat there in shock at this PEP meeting, which was completely, it was like a Putin, I'm thinking of Russia's Putin, like a show trial, okay? You had, the auditorium was packed with parents, and basically you had the apparatchiks from the mayor's office who basically had already decided what they were going to do, and you had one or two people who were kind of newly appointed who didn't really understand the issues. And this is how the decision was going to be made. So there has got to be a way, and I'm not smart enough to know how to do this, but there has got to be a way to figure out a balance where parents can have parents and the community can have real input into these decisions. And of course that school was shut down. The kids were merged into another school. It was a mess for years. It was really a tragedy. And all those teachers were immediately snapped up by other schools. Yeah.
Sounds like a hearing that recently concluded in with rezoning.
Just speak up loud so everyone can hear if you don't mind.
Could you talk about the 1993 Massachusetts Reform Act in terms of how was that able to come together and what was the coalition?
Thank you. I feel like I've planted it in here. So in many ways, that's one of my favorite stories because in some ways it's such an unlikely story, especially if you think about it these days. You had a Republican governor, Bill Weld, okay? And Democrats in both the Senate and the House in Massachusetts. And so this was a real bipartisan piece of legislation that they were trying to hammer out, right? And it was based on a three-legged stool, which was a lot more funding, over $1 billion, much of it funneled to the poorest districts, and greater accountability. Okay, so there was the accountability piece, and there was the new Massachusetts curriculum, okay? But when it came to that curriculum, all right, the curriculum was hammered out by educators. The entire ed reform, the entire lead up to that ed reform was accomplished after numerous town hall meetings all across the state. There was actually a very visionary business guy who actually insisted on bringing the teachers union to the table in the negotiations, okay? And he did that in opposition to many other business people. So you had business people, you had the teachers union, you had rank and file educators, you had local community folks, remember lots of small towns in Massachusetts. So it was very collaborative. The curriculum was controversial. Again, there were lots of wars over the curriculum. The MCAS graduation requirement, Massachusetts has a 10th grade graduation requirement. It is also quite controversial, but unlike standardized tests elsewhere in the country, it's actually considered a very high quality test, and it's an open test to educators. So each year when the MCAS is given, teachers get to see what the test was. They troubleshoot, what were good questions, what were bad questions. They're involved in the development of the next generation of tests. So it's done very, very differently. And so it was a very layered process, but there was a really strong element of collaboration and democracy.
So there's going to be a question from Josh Curtis. You had your hand up. Josue, and then I'll ask another question and we'll bring it back to the audience. Go ahead.
Loud and clear, please, so everyone can hear.
across the state is extraordinarily inequitable, and the networks resulted in confirming the segregation that exists by race and class in
Yeah.
the state.
Yeah.
And those are the issues that I think have still not been addressed in this city.
Okay, so I couldn't agree with you more on the funding aspect, okay? That's a tragedy, not just here, but elsewhere in the country. In fact, as of 2016, a majority of states were funding their schools at levels lower than they had been before the financial crisis, okay, before 2008. That's an absolutely stunning figure. That's begun to change a little bit. You know, California has upped the amount of money it's spending, et cetera. But, you know, there's no question that tax policy in this country, tax policy was a huge deal in Massachusetts, a huge reason why schools there were underfunded. They are now battling because, you know, they brought the level of funding up and they were supposed to constantly revisit the formula, but they stopped, okay? They stopped. So now there's a huge push to once again refund the schools because they're back to funding them at, you know, levels, I don't know the exactly which year, but like 10 years ago, okay? So funding, there's no question funding is huge. But I do disagree with you on the structural aspects because, you know, I've heard from too many educators and I've seen too many instances, I've been doing this a little bit longer than I probably should, of how bureaucracy, you know, rigid rules, bad superintendents, et cetera, can really get in the way, okay? And so I think that both things sort of have to happen at the same time. And let's not forget that the only reason we have this ed reform apparatus now is because it is a fundamentally top-down, it's a fundamentally top-down driven movement, which, by the way, operates on the assumption that you can do more with less. So one of the underlying themes of the ed reformers is how to wring more productivity, you know, and they really think about it in those terms, out of schools and teachers. And of course, you know, cheap teachers via Teach for America, technology that'll allow you to increase class size, all that is part of it. So I think it's both things.
Giving that adversity a score.
Yeah, adversity score. Okay, honestly, I think it's BS. And here's why I think it's BS. Because any college admissions person worth their salt knows exactly what the zip codes are, okay? They are trained to do this, all right? So I think this is just window dressing for the SAT, all right? You know, I at first thought you were going to go to the specialized, to talk about the specialized high schools. And, you know, if you're interested, one of the things I do is I actually write a column, occasional column for Bloomberg, and I have a piece there I did a couple weeks ago about what Chicago has done, okay? And it's not a perfect system, but they basically have a system that is partly based on tests, but it's also based on test performance in different zones. So zip codes are grouped in zones, and their distribution at their elite schools doesn't exactly comport with their demographics. I think, you know, Chicago is somewhere in the 80% Black and Latino range, and maybe the specialized high schools have something like 60% Black and Latino. I mean, don't quote me on this, it's in the article. But they're doing way better than New York is. And, you know, I just don't get, you know, I understand the argument of, you know, families, many of them poor families, who have struggled to send their kids to test prep and whose kids have done well on test prep, et cetera. And there are kids who do well, you know, on tests, and why shouldn't they be rewarded for that, okay? Just as there are kids who are gifted artistically and they should be rewarded for that by going to those schools, right? But why not create a system where you're looking at tests by zone, okay? So that, you know, if you're looking at schools in the Bronx, you take the top, whatever it is, 5% or 10% from the Bronx and give them a shot at those schools. You would, I think, dramatically increase diversity and and create a much better shot. But at the end of the day, it's 1% of kids attend those schools. So the challenge is, I think, is not getting into those quote unquote elite schools, but doing well by many more kids with better schools across the board.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
I'm Perez. I'm an educator for 20 years. I'm also the chapter leader for my school, the union. Maybe you know what chapter leader is, like I represent.
Yes.
In high school, is that
High
correct?
school, yeah. So many questions, so little time.
So you're a teacher also?
I'm a teacher,
Yeah,
math
yeah,
teacher, math
yeah.
teacher.
In the Bronx.
In the Bronx, good for you.
So one of the things that I believe it has failed throughout the years is that every time somebody comes and tries to do education reforms, they think that they believe they know the solution. And they don't have actually looked at what is working or not, and they just want to try something new.
Yeah.
That's reflected, for example, in the math. I've been teaching for 20 years, but I've seen 5 different curriculums. And one is extremely different from the other. So like if I'm teaching a curriculum now,
No, absolutely, and the pendulum is swinging, right? So let me start with the union, because that's the most. So I actually very deliberately ended up not. I was going to do a chapter on the union, but it was like too much. It was too complicated. And what I can say is that the union has to be part of the solution. Okay, teachers have to be. But this is so. You know, I spent a lot of time in public schools, and I spent time in successful public schools. And in those public schools, the teachers were you know, they were leading the change, whatever that change had to be within that community, okay? You know, Janice has put the union on notice. And, you know, I do know from having talked to a lot of educators that there are, you know, union people who teachers feel represent them and union people who they feel do not represent them. But one of the things that's happened as a result of Janice, and I don't know where this is going to go down the road, but in California,
Andrea, please.
Yeah.
Everyone, Janice, if you don't know,
Sorry.
a U.S. Supreme Court case that basically said that unions have to provide all of the benefits to all employees. They don't have to pay dues. And
Right,
so
you don't have to pay
basically
dues.
now people can opt out for paying dues, in essence, break
Right.
the backs of unions.
Right.
That is the
Right.
union busting, and it's all over the country.
right,
Sorry, go ahead.
right, but
Public union.
yeah, public sector unions. But keep in mind that unions, both in the private sector and in the public sector, have been under assault for years. I don't have the statistics at hand, but that has dealt a huge blow to the middle class, as you all know. But you know, a funny thing has happened in California in particular. Okay, the Janus decision has really galvanized sort of grassroots activism on the part of teachers and many union members. And I've talked to union leaders in California who've said, you know, this is a two-sided thing. The union is now going to have to be much more responsive to its rank and file membership and to the local community, okay? And we saw that with the teacher strikes in Los Angeles. I don't know enough about the teacher strike in Oakland, but there has been a positive effect in that sense. Does this represent a huge challenge for the union? Absolutely. But I think those are sort of really interesting developments. And in terms of the renewal schools, you know, I don't feel like I know enough about them. What I've read, I was not terribly, you know, impressed by the way the administration went about this. You know, I will say that among the progressive educators who I think most folks in this town respect the most, they are really on the fence about this question about what do you do about large, especially large schools that have really failed for a long time. Okay, it's a challenge. Okay, and it's not clear to me, I'm being honest, it's not clear to me that there isn't a place in certain instances for taking over those schools and replacing them in some way, but it has to be done incredibly thoughtfully, including at the Julia Richmond complex when they phased out the old Julia Richmond High School. Okay, even Ann Cook will say it broke her heart to see the juniors and seniors who were about to graduate from the old high school, and who saw all of these resources coming in for the new small schools. And they had been, these older kids had been left behind, right? Now, mind you, she did that back in the 90s, okay? So hopefully we would have learned since then, but you're right that there's been too much churn. And that's one of the tragedies to me of the Bloomberg administration. He had 12 years. He had the same chancellor for 8 of those years, okay? If there was ever an opportunity to try to kind of establish something with roots, okay, that might last, and of course he was going to make mistakes, everybody does, right? But what's lasted from the Bloomberg years? Nothing. It was an incredibly wasted opportunity because there was no trust, because there was this constant churn, and because educators weren't included in, and I partly blame de Blasio, right? I mean, he had an opportunity to preserve some of what, some of the good things that happened under Bloomberg, but, the baby out with the bathwater, okay?
So I just have a question, and then Carol, and I'll let you out. So we're talking about corporate reformers. We're talking about schools that are labeled as failing, and we're talking about parent involvement. Where in that whole scheme of things do you think charter schools play a role? Do you feel that they offer parents a real choice?
Okay. Wow, that's $1 million question. Okay. Charter schools, all right? So the gentleman in front is going like this, right? Okay. So the animating idea for charter schools, okay, came from Al Shanker, all right? He had a great idea, which was to create spaces for innovation. And by the way, the progressive small schools movement was very kind of charter-like in its origins, okay? But again, what you had was the takeover of this positive idea. And there's a great book by Jeff, it'll come to me. It's called something Spin. I apologize, I'll try to find it. In which he talks about the conservative takeover of the charter movement as part of an effort to get rid of government in this particular sphere. So it was part of a movement. You start with the schools and then you get government out of all these other spheres as well, okay? So, and by the way, this is an incredibly pernicious movement. One of my chapters, which we haven't even touched on, is on New Orleans. And what happened in New Orleans is, yes, you had a takeover of the local schools. You had the firing of seasoned educators of a large swath of the city's African-American middle class, a takeover by out of town, often out of state, big philanthropy-backed ed reformers. Bright young things, mostly white young teachers from TFA coming in to substitute as scabs, okay? I'm going to call it what it is. And most of this, and it's a 2-tier education system, by the way, in New Orleans. You have the quote-unquote successful schools, which were richer, whiter, et cetera, that remained part of the Orleans Parish School Board, and then you had the majority of schools which were taken over by the state, okay, and they were poor and African American, okay? And what you saw was the CMOs, the KIPPs of the world, and KIPP-like schools came in. And by the way, there's a place for schools like KIPP, no excuses charter schools. I'm sure they do well by some kids, okay? They came in and they took over all the schools, the non-selective schools. So was there choice? If you were poor and African American and couldn't get into one of the selective schools, did you have choice? Not really. You went to a no excuses charter school where your chances of being suspended, expelled, et cetera, and ending up in the criminal justice system were way higher. And one of the things that I document in my book, which Diane Ravitch, by the way, has called the best sort of narrative on what happened in New Orleans, is the many efforts, community-led efforts to create local charter schools and how they fared under this charter regime, this corporate-led charter regime in New Orleans, okay? And this is not just happening in New Orleans, okay? You now have the city plan, which is led by a former hedge fund guy from Enron and the head of Netflix, and they are going to spend, I think it's $250 million to bring the portfolio model to 40 cities across America. And you have Eli Broad, who was going to take over the public schools in Los Angeles. The brakes have been put on him a little bit because of the teacher strike and because of the backlash over how much money was being drained out of the public schools to go into the charters. So I think in some ways, if we can use that businessese, is ever going to recover from this. But the original animating idea was not such a terrible idea. The idea of doing innovation on a community level, right? That's not what it's become. I'm sorry, I got kind of carried away there.
No, we can always get carried
Right.
away when our charter schools are down.
Right.
I think Carol
failed for 12 straight years as leader of our education system here. And that is the equivalent to one child's entire public school career studying in New York City. And then that's probably divided by, that's probably about 80,000 students per year, correct? In the New York City
Right.
public school system.
Right.
Because I believe we have 1 million students here.
Right.
It's mind-boggling.
Right, but he failed systemically. But I will say, and I think this is important, okay, that if you talk to all those progressive educators, and maybe you're one of them, he protected, okay, he protected a lot, but it's, again, you have to know who to protect, right? But he protected Joe Klein protected many of those progressive educators, who he thought were doing good work, okay? So, which, by the way, I don't think happened under de Blasio, okay? Under Farina, I think it was basically, again, corporate bureaucracy, not corporate, but the education bureaucracy, command and control, et cetera. So I agree with you that Bloomberg failed systemically, but he did protect a lot of innovation that happened in pockets around the country, around the city, is that there are schools that are doing a very good job, like the international high schools. There are funding challenges. Segregation is a huge challenge. The constant churn of new ed reform ideas, the pursuit of standardized testing. I mean, the problem is that so much has gone on, both on the federal level with No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, at the state level with funding, with Cuomo's push to put charter schools in public schools. And again, I don't think you have to be a charter opponent, and I keep trying to kind of be sort of measured on this, and not be outraged that you give prime real estate to charter schools in poor communities and create absolutely no incentives for collaboration, for giving back something to the local community, et cetera. So, I wish I had an answer for you, but I think the problems are so incredibly complex that the best answer I can offer is to look at what's worked and suggest that maybe we have to try to create the structures and the funding to scale that.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. So my name is Jasmine. I am a UCD member, and I'm very excited because starting in July, I'll be a new CEC 6 council. And I know you were speaking earlier about school in Hartford, about school in Hartford that's very successful, ended up closing down. And the fact that there were 7 slots for charter schools and yet 15 got approved, which is a lot more than 7 in space, that's double the amount.
Right.
How much of a fear should we have that even if a successful school ended up closing, that schools that are not successful, schools that are failing, that have low grades, how much of a fear that we need to have about them closing, just charter schools just take over?
So again, I'm a moderate person. They call me Pollyanna, but I think there's a lot to fear, and here's why. There is a lot of money. Okay, I mean, look at the governor. He is totally in the pocket of the charter movement. I mean, he's trying to now burnish his progressive credentials, but there's enormous money and pressure coming from the hedge fund guys, Wall Street, et cetera, in favor of charter schools. And, even though, there have been a lot of, even if you don't call them failures, there have been a lot of questions raised about charters, but they just keep doubling down because fundamentally it's a movement that's anti-union, okay? That is an animating force behind it, and they want to privatize, okay? So I think this is an absolutely huge issue, and one of the things, by the way, one of the policy debates that I feel we do not have, and that would be a very useful policy debate to have, is to try to address what I call and I've been talking about this for years, the tipping point question. So in East Harlem, in Harlem generally, about 1 in 4 kids now attends a charter school. So what that's done to the local public schools, and I actually created a graph of this, which I posted on my blog, you can actually see that the percentage of traditional public schools with super high English language learner rates and special needs rates has skyrocketed, okay? Whereas in the charter schools, it's really low, okay? But I mean, orders of magnitude. And no one as far as I know, policymakers are not addressing the question, okay, you want charter schools? Okay, what's the tipping point at which you have so many charter schools in a given neighborhood that they end up doing damage one way or the other to the local public schools? And one thought I have is maybe by trying to have that policy discussion rather than just kind of and I'm not saying you would do this, but rather than sort of an angry anti-charter school screed might be the way to go, because there's a lot of data out there on what happens in neighborhoods which have large percentages of charter schools in terms of the drain on funding, the increase in special needs kids, English language learners, et cetera, in the traditional public schools, which really kind of changes the character of those schools, creates huge challenges, et cetera. I don't need to tell the educators here about that.
2008, before the financial crisis, and this sort of nexus, between education funding and, the present day, these, massively wealthy, foundations now.
Right.
Riding in to save the day, kind of touches on this book, Winners Take All.
Yes, yeah.
So, that these folks are coming in to solve the problems that they've sort of created, right?
Right, they created, they're not paying taxes, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So, I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay.
Sort of like they built this enormous wealth having not.
Right. So, that's the philanthropy problem, and that's a real problem. That I'm not prepared to address here right now. Okay, but it's a huge problem, and it's something that I'm actually in the process of researching and writing now. But there's a whole separate issue which has to do with tax policy. Okay, it's whom do you tax, how much do you tax, and what do you do? And this has been a huge issue. It was an issue in California with Proposition 13, which, by the way, they're finally. It looks like in 2020 they're finally going to try to modify Proposition 13, which basically froze property taxes, so that you have in Anaheim, California, where Disney World is it Disney World or Disneyland? I always get them confused. Where Disney pays basically the same taxes they paid 30 years ago. Okay. And that takes money out of the school district coffers, right? But those kinds of tax laws were passed all over the country. And you have a real problem in communities where rich communities don't want to give to poor communities. And you have a real kind of class warfare thing going on, okay? So tax policy is, I think, really at the heart of this. And that's going to be a really big fight. It's already happening in some places, but it's not going to be easy. Yeah.
West said, I don't know how you do it. There is such a culture of fear that I have seen
Right.
from your remarks in the New York City school system that,
Right, right,
you know,
right.
I think that's
Yeah.
the respect.
Which is why, you know, I thought that germ of an idea of that network structure, which was never really fully realized and never, you know, there was no time, I thought had a lot of potential. For those of you who are interested in you know, how to build a culture of trust on a relatively large scale, I would urge you to look at what I've written on Leander, because that's a pretty remarkable story. A lot to learn there. Pardon?
What story?
The story of Leander, Texas. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. You guys have been a great audience. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.